He was always the reliable one, the one who kept his voice soft, his smile ready, his shoulders open to carry the weight others didn't want to bear. From the outside, he seemed admirable, kind, generous, calm. But on the inside, there was a quiet storm brewing. A storm made of swallowed words, unmet needs, and an exhausting effort to never be the problem. He didn't know exactly when this behavior began. Maybe it was in childhood, when praise followed obedience and love came with conditions. Or maybe it was simply what the world demanded from someone who wanted to be liked more than they wanted to be seen. Either way, he wore his goodness like armor. What he didn't realize is that it was slowly becoming a cage. He believed for the longest time that being good would protect him, that kindness, humility, and patience would one day be recognized, reciprocated, respected. But that day never came. Instead, what came were more demands, more expectations, and more silence. Every time he said yes when he wanted to say no, a piece of his truth slipped away. Every time he tolerated disrespect in the name of understanding, his self-respect weakened. He wasn't being noble, he was disappearing, and no one seemed to notice. That was perhaps the cruelest part. You could scream silently for years, and the world would only hear the echo of your compliance. He had learned early that approval had a price. Sometimes it was silence, sometimes it was self-denial. But either way, it was always him who paid it. Over time, this became second nature, choosing peace over honesty, connection over boundaries. But peace built on self-erasure is fragile. It cracks under the weight of resentment, of desires never voiced, of needs consistently ignored. He began to notice it in the quiet moments, how he avoided mirrors, how he hesitated before answering questions about himself, how tired he felt after conversations where he only nodded. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was the slow ache of living a life not quite his own. He didn't hate people. In fact, he deeply cared. That was the problem. His compassion had no brakes. It spilled into every corner of his life, turning into a need to fix, to support, to rescue, until he had nothing left for himself. The line between care and codependence had blurred, and beneath all his generosity lived a quiet fear that without his usefulness, he'd be invisible, that if he stopped giving, they would stop loving. So he kept giving, and they kept taking, not out of cruelty, but because he had trained them to. He had set the rules of a game he didn't want to play anymore. There came a moment, subtle, unannounced, when he realized that no one was coming to rescue him. No one would suddenly see how much he had sacrificed or reward him for being endlessly accommodating. That moment hurt more than any betrayal, because it meant he had to stop waiting. He had to stop believing that kindness alone would be enough. The world, as it turned out, didn't reward those who disappeared for the sake of harmony. It respected those who drew lines, who dared to say, "This is mine, and you cannot cross it." He started to question everything, not just others, but himself. Why did he need so badly to be seen as good? Why did disagreement feel like danger? Why did he say yes when everything in him screamed no? And when he sat with those questions, really sat with them, he found something deeper. Fear. Fear of rejection. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of being unloved. That fear had shaped his entire personality. It had taught him to perform instead of express, to conform instead of confront. And now that fear was asking for a reckoning. He realized he had been wearing a mask so well crafted, even he had forgotten it wasn't real. A mask of calm, of gentleness, of unshakable patience. But beneath it, there was a voice, small, raw, neglected, that wanted to scream, a voice that said, "I'm tired. Tired of hiding anger behind smiles. Tired of calling fear by the name of empathy. Tired of being easy to love because he made no demands." That voice was his truth, and it had been suffocating under the weight of being liked. This wasn't about becoming someone else. It was about finally becoming himself. But that idea was terrifying, because he didn't know who he was without the role of the nice one, without the reflex to smooth things over, to stay agreeable, to never make waves. If he stopped being who others expected him to be, who would he become? The question lingered like a door left ajar. Behind it, both freedom and fear. But something in him, something long buried, was starting to stir. And it wasn't asking for permission anymore. He began to observe the world with new eyes. He noticed how those who set boundaries were rarely questioned, how those who said no without flinching moved through life with a quiet confidence. It wasn't that they were cruel, they were simply clear. And clarity, he realized, was power. For so long, he had mistaken kindness for goodness, and goodness for virtue. But virtue without strength is often mistaken for weakness, and weakness, in a world that feeds on certainty, becomes an invitation for exploitation. It wasn't enough to be kind. Not anymore. He needed to be kind and powerful, compassionate and grounded, soft and unmovable when it mattered. That balance had always seemed out of reach, like two opposing forces he had to choose between. But Machiavelli's words echoed in his mind. The prince must be a lion and a fox, not one or the other. Both. He didn't have to become someone hard. He had to become someone whole. And wholeness meant reclaiming the parts of him he had buried in the name of being good. The shift didn't happen overnight. It began in small moments. Pauses where he would normally rush to agree. Silences he allowed to stretch a little longer before answering. The first no he spoke out loud trembled on his lips, but something inside him steadied. It was unfamiliar, yet grounding. He was no longer seeking conflict, but he was no longer afraid of it either. There was a strange kind of peace in that. Not the peace of being liked, but the peace of finally being honest. People noticed. Some subtly pulled away, others pushed back, challenged his change, accused him of becoming distant or cold. And for a brief moment, the old guilt returned, sharp and persuasive. But this time, he didn't cave. He saw their discomfort for what it was, a reaction to lost control. His compliance had served them well. His awakening, not so much. Yet he understood now. Those who only loved him when he was convenient never truly loved him. They loved the version of him that never asked for anything. He started to feel something he hadn't felt in a long time. Presence, not just in rooms, but in his own skin. Decisions began to feel deliberate. Conversations became more real. He laughed differently, less as a reflex, more from the gut. He no longer needed to perform emotional gymnastics to make others comfortable, and though it was unfamiliar territory, it was also exhilarating. He was no longer living as a mirror to reflect others. He was learning to stand as his own light. Still, there were moments of doubt, nights when he questioned whether he was becoming selfish, or whether the solitude that followed his clarity was worth it. But in those quiet hours, he also felt something sacred. Space. Space to think, to feel, to choose. It was a kind of emotional oxygen he had never allowed himself. And in that space, the fear began to shrink. Not vanish completely, but lose its grip. What remained was not certainty, but courage. the courage to live without constantly needing permission. He understood now that strength wasn't about raising his voice or building walls. It was about knowing when to walk away, when to stop explaining himself, when to let silence do the work that words never could. That kind of strength wasn't loud, but it was unmistakable. It shifted the way people responded to him. He noticed that his presence alone began to carry weight, not because he demanded it, but because he had stopped giving himself away so easily. He thought back to Machiavelli, not the villainized version, but the thinker who saw the world for what it was. A place where appearances mattered, and where integrity without boundaries became a sacrifice no one acknowledged. It wasn't about manipulation. It was about awareness, the power to choose how you show up and for whom, the wisdom to understand that kindness without discernment is not a virtue, but a vulnerability. He could still care deeply, but now he chose where his care went, and that changed everything. Somewhere along the way, he stopped needing to be understood by everyone. That need, once so loud and urgent, had quieted. He realized it wasn't his job to be digestible, to shrink his truth into something others could easily accept. Not everyone would approve of his boundaries. Not everyone would like the version of him that no longer said yes by default. But that was no longer a problem, because he wasn't living for their comfort anymore. He was living for alignment, with his values, his energy, his peace. There was freedom in that shift. And with freedom came something unexpected, respect, not just from others, but from himself. He had spent so long trying to earn worthiness through sacrifice that he forgot it could come from self-honoring. It felt unfamiliar to treat his time and emotions as sacred, but the more he did, the more natural it became. What once felt like rebellion now felt like restoration. He wasn't being difficult, he was being whole, and in that wholeness, he found a kind of strength that didn't need validation. It simply was. He no longer measured his goodness by how much he gave or how little he asked for. He measured it by his ability to stay true to himself, even when it was uncomfortable. That shift reframed everything. He could be kind and still walk away. He could forgive and still say, "This isn't acceptable." He could love without losing himself. What once seemed like contradictions were now coexistences. Complexity wasn't something to be feared anymore. It was something to be embodied. His life didn't suddenly become easier. In fact, in some ways it became more complex. But it became his. The choices he made, the people he allowed in, the energy he gave, all of it came from a place of awareness. And with that awareness came peace. Not the fragile peace of appeasement, but the grounded peace of self-respect. He had stopped asking, "What do they think of me?" and started asking, "What do I think of this?" And that simple shift began to shape everything he touched. He had feared, at the beginning, that choosing himself would make him harder. That strength would cost him his softness. But it didn't. In fact, it refined it. His kindness became more intentional, his empathy more discerning. He no longer gave out of fear, of abandonment, of conflict, of being unloved. He gave because he chose to. And in that choice, his heart became both softer and stronger. He could finally hold space for others without abandoning himself in the process. There are still days when the old patterns whisper, "Be agreeable, don't rock the boat, make them happy." But now he recognizes them for what they are, echoes of a life he no longer belongs to. He doesn't shame those echoes. He thanks them. They kept him safe once. But safety is no longer his only goal. Wholeness is. And wholeness requires truth, even when it's messy, even when it's misunderstood, even when it costs something. So he walks differently now, not with arrogance, but with alignment, not with the need to prove himself, but with the calm knowing that he has nothing to apologize for. He is no longer the person who disappeared so others could feel comfortable. He's the one who stays with his needs, his values, his boundaries, and from that place, he gives, fully, freely, and only when it's real. Because in the end, being good isn't about being liked. It's about being honest, with yourself first, and then with the world. And sometimes, the most radical act of goodness is daring to take up space, to speak, to choose, to live as someone who no longer waits for permission to exist.